Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a research document that lays out a pretty fascinating framework, one that's both prophetic and geopolitical, to make sense of what's happening in the world right now. The core idea? That there's a direct, traceable line from religious policies made back in the 1960s to a major global crisis that's on the horizon.
So here's the big question, right? Is all the chaos we're seeing just a series of random, unconnected events? Or is it possible that it's all part of a much older, much more deliberate plan? Well, the source material we're looking at today argues pretty strongly for that second option. It suggests there's a clear pattern, a blueprint, connecting a religious council from 60 years ago to the conflicts we see today. So let's jump right in.
Okay, so where does this all begin? According to this framework, the absolute starting point, the foundation for everything else, is a single event, the Second Vatican Council. The source identifies this as the moment the entire policy architecture for our current world was put into place.
Now, Vatican II, which ran from 62 to 65, was absolutely monumental. It wasn't just some internal meeting. For the very first time, they invited Protestant and Orthodox observers to the table. This, according to the source, marked a fundamental shift in strategy for the Catholic Church, a pivot away from outright condemnation and towards a new model of invitation and dialogue.
And this is fascinating. The source document anchors its entire argument in this one verse from the book of Daniel. The idea here is that the primary tool for global change wouldn't be brute force or open warfare. Instead, the verse queens to policy and peace. It's suggesting that diplomacy, strategy, and ecumenical outreach, exactly the kinds of tools sharpened at Vatican II, would be the real mechanisms of power.
So what did this new policy actually look like? Well, the source highlights these three key documents as the strategic pillars. You've got Unitatis Redintegratio, which basically laid out the roadmap for Christian unity. Then there's Dignitatis Humanae, which positioned the Church as the global authority on what constitutes true religious freedom. And finally, Gaudium et Spes, which wove the Church's mission directly into the fabric of global politics and economics. Together, these three formed a powerful blueprint for a totally new kind of influence.
Okay, so you've got the blueprint, but a blueprint is useless without a builder, right? Or in this case, an enforcer. The source argues that a global power was needed to actually implement this vision, and for that, it turns to the book of Revelation, claiming it identifies a second major power that would rise up and put this plan into action on the world stage.
And that power, according to the source, is the United States, identified through this really interesting dual prophecy. The lamb-like horns are said to represent America's founding ideals, civil and religious liberty. But the prophecy goes on to say that this nation would eventually speak with the voice of a dragon. The interpretation here is that it would begin to use its immense global power to coerce and to enforce compliance, acting in a way that directly contradicts its own founding principles.
This slide really breaks down the sequence of events as laid out in Revelation 13. First, this new power emerges. Second, it starts to wield the same kind of global influence as the first power. Third, and this is crucial, it makes the world align with that first power. And finally, step 4, it builds the infrastructure for complete economic control, a system where your ability to participate in the economy is tied to your compliance. And that final step, economic control, is the absolute key to understanding the mechanism at play here. The argument is that in the 21st century, the primary weapon isn't tanks or bombs, it's the global economy itself. So how does this actually work in the real world? Well, the source points to data like this. Take a look at Europe's energy situation. Its reliance on Russian gas absolutely plummeted, forcing it into a brand new energy alignment, this time with the United States. According to this document, this move effectively stripped Europe of its independent geopolitical leverage.
And then there's this number, $300 billion. The source calls this a financial nuclear bomb. By freezing another country's central bank reserves, the dollar-based financial system showed the world it had the power to literally cut a nation off from its own wealth. It was a stunning demonstration of how finance could be weaponized.
And as you can see here, this new friendship came at a very steep price. The document actually quotes the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who pointed out that Europe was suddenly paying up to 4 times more for American gas. And he said, and I'm quoting here, that this was not exactly the meaning of friendship.
Now, as you can imagine, this kind of intense economic pressure doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The source argues it's creating huge fractures in the global order, setting the stage for a major confrontation. One, it claims, was actually prophesied thousands of years ago in the book of Daniel.
We hear a lot of talk these days about de-dollarization, but this chart shows the reality on the ground.
The US dollar's dominance over global finance is still incredibly strong. And according to the source material, this isn't just a fact of economics, it's the critical infrastructure needed to maintain global control.
So the source takes this ancient conflict from Daniel chapter 11 and reframes it for our time. It identifies the king of the north as the United States-led bloc and the king of the south as the challenger bloc, led primarily by China and the other BRICS nations.
And this push from the King of the South isn't just theoretical. The document points to these very real, concrete steps being taken. The BRICS nations are actively building a parallel financial system. They're trading in their own currencies, developing new payment networks, and buying up gold, all in an effort to operate outside of U.S. control.
So, how do you tie all of this together? You've got religious policy from the 60s, you've got American military and economic power, and you've got this emerging economic conflict. Well, the source proposes a final interpretive model that connects all the dots.
First up is M, for Mount. This represents the warning dimension, drawing from the prophecies in Matthew 24. The focus here isn't on physical persecution, but on sophisticated deception and a specific kind of pressure called phlipsis, which the source connects directly to the mental, economic, and psychological stress we've been talking about.
Next is R for river. This explains the how, the mechanism. It's based on Daniel's visions. The river Ulai is interpreted as the world's most powerful leaders making policy, while the river Hiddekel represents the incredibly fast rushing speed of geopolitical events that can feel sudden, confusing, and completely overwhelming.
And finally, there's I for island, which points to the book of Revelation and describes the prophesied outcome. This is the end game, a complete union of religious and civil power, which finalizes global economic control and creates a fragile, top-heavy system that, according to the prophecy, is ultimately destined to fall apart.
In the end, the document doesn't close with a date or a specific prediction. It ends with this final, sober warning from the book of Revelation. It's presented as an appeal, a call to seriously consider the implications of the system we've just walked through. It really leaves us with a question to chew on. In a world where it seems policy, power, and prophecy are all converging, how do you navigate what comes next?